Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. This is your channel for photography, for wildlife, and for wildlife photography. And man, I've got a great one for you today. We're going to talk about low-key photography, some of the basics, but specifically, we're going to talk about its application to wildlife photography. And you're not going to want to miss this one. I'll tell you all about it right after this. Now in today's video, it's all about low-key photography. In just a minute, I'm going to explain what it is, and you may have heard this term before. What I really want to get into beyond just a definition is its applications and some tips and tricks and things to think about. What makes it so effective, and as a wildlife photographer, how do I utilize it? Now, if you're not a wildlife photographer, feel free to view this because a lot of the concepts are going to relate to any genre of photography. For this video, I've elicited the help of my Patreon team, and they've submitted some images to go over here. I'm going to show you those in just a minute. I'm going to show you some of my own images, and then at the end of the video, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and things to think about in the future. Now, before we get into some of those images, let's just think about the basics, and let's start with a basic premise or definition. Low-key photography is a genre of photography that deals in the lower tones or the darker tones of an image. It really accentuates the darker shadows and sometimes even the blacks of an image, and it minimizes some of the use of highlights and whites. Now, that is not to say that an image has to be all dark or all black, and I'll show you some examples of that. And in fact, when using selective lighting, it can be a very, very interesting way to combine an image that is predominantly in the dark tones, but also includes some accents provided by highlights. Now, this can be defined a lot differently by a lot of different people. In fact, I've actually heard somebody say that a true low-key image is only one that contains all values on the left side of a histogram. But what does that mean? Well, before we get started, for people that are just starting out in photography or curious about this, I am going to show you an image of a histogram, and this is something that every photographer should know. Now, if you already know what a histogram is, don't worry about it. I may have some information in here that you haven't heard of before, but let's just look at what this is. Now, real quickly, we'll do this high level. I'm going to pop a histogram up here. I'm going to put a couple of values in here that we're going to talk about quickly, but what is the point of a histogram? It's to show us where the brightness or the lightness values are in an image. The more dark tones you have in an image, the histogram will be pushed to the left, and the more white or light or highlighted tones it has, it will be pushed to the right. If you were to break this histogram up, you're going to see a few numbers at the bottom. The far left is going to include a 0, and that is true black. And at the far right, you're going to see a 255 that represents true white. Those numbers are pretty important because actually all colors get assigned a value between 0 and 255. So even an individual color has a value. So when we think about this histogram, those are the ranges that we're dealing with. But when we deal with an image, what we're really talking about is the total number of pixels in that image and how bright and how dark it is. If I took this image and I slid my exposure down to the left, we're always going to talk about the left being darker, so get used to that term for newer photographers. And we're always going to talk about the right being brighter. But as I push that down towards 0, you're going to see the image get darker and darker and darker. And if I go the other way with my exposure, you're going to see that image get brighter and brighter and brighter. In today's video, we're going to talk about those dark tones and those images that really are dominated by these dark tones. Now, why would we do that? Well, I'm going to pull up some images. We're going to talk about that. And I'm going to show you some of these key philosophies around these things to think about as we look at these images. So let me switch views. And what you're going to see flashing over here are a bunch of images that were submitted from my patrons over on my Patreon site. And I do this from time to time where we gather images, we talk about them. Sometimes we even do live discussions on these images. And the theme we had was around these low-key images, and I asked for some submissions. Now, these are a lot of submissions, and you're going to see variances of what's in there, but you're all going to have a theme, and the theme is going to be around it being kind of dark. And one of the key aspects of using these low-key images, especially with wildlife photography, is that you can use these to create a mood. You're going to hear this idea about drama, maybe things being dramatic, maybe things being melancholy or somber, and we often think about that in terms of dark tones, even the word mysterious. You're also going to notice some of these do a really nice job with creating minimalism and isolationism. So we're going to talk about all of that as you look at these. Down in the comments, if you find one or two of these images and you're like, wow, that one's really, really great, I love that, put it down in the comments. I'm sure they would love to know which ones you particularly liked. But all of these images carry darker tones, and they're really dominated by these dark tones. So let's talk about some of these core ideas, or these really principal ideas. One is lighting, and this is probably the most important of these, and that is using lighting that is appropriate for the mood that you want to create. Often with low-key images, we are no longer shooting front-lit images. So we're often using light at angles, or often backlit. So it's really, really important that you understand when you're working with low-key photography, you're always dealing with, or often dealing with, lighting that is not typical of being front lit. So you want to put yourself in a position where you're maximizing that, where you're getting out of your comfort zone a little bit, and you're always looking at the backgrounds. In these low-key images, what you're going to often see is the background is very, very dark, and that is typical. Doesn't have to be all the time, but it's very, very typical. And to do that, often your backgrounds may even be in shadows. Another core concept to me is the exposure settings when you're out in the field. We want to do as much of this right in the field as you can. So when you think about your exposure settings, we often will underexpose. And again, when we get back to that histogram, we're going to push our histogram to the left just a little, being careful not to underexpose it to a point where it would become too dark and we would lose some of the values to the left. Remember, anytime something gets to 0, it becomes pure black. And once something becomes pure black, it's really difficult to deal with. But we want to underexpose maybe by 1 or 2 stops. That's kind of a safe rule out in the field. We may also want to look at the types of exposure we're using. So when you're setting your camera, you may want to prioritize your settings for the highlights and let the darker areas or the midtones become even darker, or let those midtones become shadows. And we do that by exposing for the brightest area of the scene. Some cameras even have a highlight priority setting where you can expose based off of the absolute brightest area of your scene. Another core idea for me is composition. This one's really, really interesting. I want you to look at some of these images that I've been flashing over here, and I want you to think about using composition to keep it simple, using it to accentuate the subject or part of the subject, and then I want you to think about this idea of minimalism and simplification and negative space. Over there, some of these images really did a nice job with that, and I'll highlight some of those at the end of the video. We're also going to talk about color. Now, these images that you look over there, I want you to notice that many of them are monochromatic, but not all. Some of them, like that, have some color in it, even though the colors are in the darker tones, but many of these are going to have more of a monochromatic or even a black and white feel to them. So color is an important part of this, but also getting out of just thinking about color and thinking about light value, and even blacks and whites will really help when you're out in the field. And then finally, post-processing. Some of this can be achieved in post-processing. I'm going to pull up a few of my images in just a second, and I'm going to show you that. But remember, down in the comments, let me know if any of these really struck you as being powerful. I've got a few that I'm going to show you at the end of the video that I really, really like. Now, I had mentioned that post-processing is important, and I'm going to show you how this can be achieved in post-processing, but I don't want you to think of it as just being a post-processing effect. This can all happen in camera if you get your settings right and you know what you're doing, but typically we're going to underexpose in the field, and then we're going to accentuate what we want to accentuate in post-processing at the end, and I've got some images to show you there. All right, now I'm going to pop this off. I'm going to change my format just a little bit. So I've pulled up a few of my personal images, and we're going to talk about these low-key concepts as it relates to specific photos that I had pulled out of my gallery. Now, this first one really exemplifies the idea of having a dark background, but not limiting your photo to just dark tones. There are a few highlights in here that really help create a shape, and they help create a focus. Now, this would be considered minimalist because most of this is done with negative space. So all of that dark area at the top and bottom, we consider that negative space. And then that subject is really, even though it's small in frame, it really stands out. I want you to pay particular attention to the gaze. And I've used this, I've got another example coming up. I've used this idea to accentuate the look. When a photograph really becomes about being a stare or a look or the eyes, sometimes minimizing the rest of the scene gets you your attention focused there. Let's take a look at one more that is very, very similar to this. It's a little bit bigger, and I remember this look being really, really intense. A couple of things I liked about this particularly. I really liked that little bill shape and how the highlights of the bill kind of give some definition to it. But I want you to notice that in these, you can still define the image. We still see what it is. Now, the artist artistically may want to blend some of this subject out and kind of hide it into the background. And you could do that with dark subjects. I prefer to have shape shown by that very subtle light. So when we look around this head and the eyes, you could see you can still make out shape, but it kind of blends into that darker background. So an idea about focusing and using these low-key images for focus. Now here's one I talked earlier about highlight priority and exposing for highlights. The effect of this was generally done in camera. So I remember specifically choosing a highlight priority in my camera. That allowed me to expose for the whitest part of the bird. And this common merganser has a very white breast, and that forced the background into a darker scene. And then in post-processing, which I had mentioned earlier, I darkened the background just a little bit more, but made sure I maintained and I actually dodged a little bit of the head to bring that out and to get that shape back. So the whole head didn't disappear into the background. So this was a combination of things being intentionally done in the field, using that exposure priority, that highlight priority, and then also some post-processing that was done to accentuate it. When you look at this, I just want you to pick a word. Like, what does this look like to you? If you had to describe this image in a very few words, to me, this is moody. Like, that's the word I always come back to. And often when I'm dealing with low-key photography, I come back to that word a lot. Does it feel moody? And I think this one captured that. I got a couple more that I wanted to show you because I talked about this idea of color versus monochromatic and that you can have low-key images that still have color. And so while this is a low-key image, I want you to notice the subject is very small in frame, but it does stand out enough that it works. So this was done primarily in the field, and then a little bit of post-processing just to burn down a few areas and make it a little darker with managing those highlighted areas to be kept. I like this one a lot, but I wanted to use it specifically in this example because I thought it was a good use of low-key image combined with a little bit of color. I've got a couple more that we're going to go through here real quick. You'll notice I just showed you a bunch of ducks. Owls work really, really well for this. We think of owls nocturnally often, so they naturally make good subjects. By the way, this one I have shown on the channel before. It's got that little edge to it, that little piece of the bark over there has a shape to it that looks like a heron. I titled this The Owl and the Heron. I thought it was a clever title. I don't know what you think, but I really, really like this. Owls make really nice subjects, as do many of these nocturnal animals. So I showed you some waterfowl. I showed you an owl. I want you to notice all of these have this moody kind of feel to them, a little mysterious, sometimes a little dramatic. Now, one of the tips I'm going to give you at the end is going to deal with this idea of the right subject for the right mood. And I want you to just take a break from this low-key photography for a second. And I want you to think about shorebirds. I want you to think about sandpipers and wading birds and what does it feel like when you look at those? And when I think of them, I'm thinking of the beach, I'm thinking of the marshes, I'm thinking of beautiful sunrises, I'm thinking of color. I'm thinking of a different mood. So oftentimes when we talk about using low-key photography, we want to get it right for the subject or the mood. And in this case, if I was shooting shorebirds, I don't often think of them as low-key. Maybe you do, but I don't. And I also don't think of songbirds that way. But getting back to this image, this was an example of a songbird that I actually thought worked pretty good. I can remember this was later in the winter, not a lot of leaves out there. The mood was pretty dark and gloomy, and I thought this red-headed woodpecker really stood out in that environment. Most of this was captured in the field with that background being in shadow, the subject getting a little bit of light, and then in post-processing, we just accentuated it a little bit. One of the things that was important to me in the field was getting that woodpecker away from the trees. So you'll notice it's kind of composed right in between two trees in the background. That saved me from having that woodpecker stand out against a highlighted area that may not have worked as well. So again, in the field, just composing a little bit. I often get these, and I didn't do a lot in macro, I'm going to touch on it. We often can do this in macro. We have a lot more control over light when we do our macro setups. I want you to notice a focus on composition. For me, these minimalistic ideas become very simple and the compositions become very, very important Notice that slight curve of the branch. I thought that was really, really nice. And I accentuated that by kind of minimizing the background. With macro photography, we often do this with flash. So we flash a certain area of the scene. We don't flash the rest of the scene. The rest of the scene gets black. You'll see a lot of macro photographers have very dark or black backgrounds. And then I talked about accentuating an area and really drawing focus to it. This isn't a minimalist composition, but it is very powerful in that it draws you directly to the eyes and the color of those eyes instantly. So really, really powerful. I got one more image to show you of mine. Then I'm going to get back to a couple of Patreon images. I've got a guest image. A friend of mine submitted a couple of images. I'm going to show you his work. But I wanted to talk about this one. This is, to me, a very nice image. Common grackle. It's not something that's going to be hard to find in this area. I actually shot this in daylight. I shot it in a wooded area. He was on the ground. And I had nothing else to shoot that day but this one subject. When I got home, I didn't love the image, but I thought, let me play around with this in post-processing. A couple years ago, I did a video on this on my Patreon site. I showed this edit. This is not what it originally looked like. The original scene was much brighter, but I thought it could be powerful and moody if I got creative with the editing. So while I do try to get it right in camera and I do try to underexpose and do that, I wanted to show you sometimes what you can do in post-processing. And this was a pretty good example, probably the most processed image I've done like this with this low-key look. And I wanted to put it on this channel, or on this video rather, to kind of show you what you can do in post-processing. Now, I told you I was going to pull up a few of my favorite images from my Patreon submissions, and this is one of them. I'm going to tie this back into some of those key concepts we just talked about. But what I liked about this was this idea of the shape being very easy to identify. The pose is magnificent, and being minimalistic here works because it's more about that pose than it is about the background or the environment. For those of you who know me, by the way, as a photographer, I love the inclusion of environment. I love to put a bird where it feels right. But there are so many different styles that are effective. I don't want to get locked into teaching one style to my groups, so I try to show a variety. And I think this is a really good example of a time when this low-key image works really, really well, and it still gets very nice use of shape. So you could still identify the eye, the breast, the bird, the bill, the pose. It's all really, really nice, and since it's about the pose, it kind of makes sense to focus just on that and keep the rest a little bit more minimized. I mentioned sometimes it's good to show shape with low-key images. This is one of my favorite, as these underwings are exposed just right. Now, I don't know, this is by Cami Fried. I don't know exactly how she shot this in the field, but it looks to be exposed for the highlights. And when you do that, that darker area, probably in shadow, gets really, really, really dark. And it works so well with the subjects because the subject also has a lot of dark tones to it. And so what stands out are just these wings and the tail. I thought this was an exceptional example of composition, and it doesn't have to be super close. It doesn't have to be super tight. It's got really, really nice balance. I thought that one was extremely well done. I talked about a focus area and accentuating a focus area. And this is a low-key image. The vast majority of this image is in the shadows. The only parts that aren't are those true colors of the eye and right around the bill. It's just I think they would call that the gape, but it's just a beautiful image. This is a cormorant taken by Ed Daly. I thought this was a magnificent job. The other thing I wanted to point out, we'd mentioned artistically you do different things. Look at you, we still get shape in the head. See, that's that gentle curve and some small details here on the feathers back here. Nothing that distracts us from the eye, but it just complements it really, really nice. So really well done. I got another hooded merganser. I loved this. I would have loved this with the drake. I would have loved this just alone with the hen. By the way, I've done some images with the hen on dark backgrounds. They are absolutely stunning when you get the colors right. This one by Daniel Gomez, just a really, really beautiful image. And I wanted to show it to you here. It just shows the couple, this pair of ducks really, really well, these hooded mergansers. So great job, Daniel. Now this next image to me is just about this color of the eye. And notice it's a very small part of the overall image. Most of this is minimized by the use of these dark tones in the background, a couple splashes of light here and there on the wings, but then our attention just goes right to the eye. So I thought this was a really nice example Kind of like the one I just showed you with that cormorant, where we can get a subject defined or an area defined very quickly by minimizing the rest. I've got two more. This is by Kate Geary. These probably my favorite three of this series. I've got this American coot, and this is just really, really neat. I wanted to show you this backlighting and how well this works and why it is so important to get out of just front shooting subjects, but the shape is really, really well defined. This one might be this was tough to choose a favorite out of this group, but man, is this good. Prashant Garpur. Look at the pose, look at the, everything is just about those wings. And by minimizing the background, putting it in shadow, and just focusing on that, it gives us a tremendous appreciation of the shape of this. And then John Davis sent me this, and I thought, man, this is just so, so good. Notice that the background is all in shadow. Very, very nice job on the edits here. And again, I don't see the original of this, I just see the final copy. The eyes are just right, they're not overdone. Those pine cones have little accents of light on it. We get this leading line of the branch leading up to the owl. This is just outstanding. So I thought those were really, really well done. I did want to show you one other thing, because it's not all birds. Now, I do primarily birds. I reach out to some of my friends and I said, hey, I'm doing a video on low-key stuff. Can you send me some stuff that is not birds? And this guy gets me, he's so good. I get angry sometimes. So I want you to show you, Matt does underwater photography. He does a lot of snakes and reptiles. So he does stuff that I don't do. I have a tremendous appreciation for his work. He sent me a series of bears. I'll kind of show you what they looked like. And I wanted something that was dark and fit into the theme, but really talked about this idea of rim light and how you can use that. So that was one. Look at this. Still, I would consider this low-key. I mean, there's a lot of highlights in the bottom of this, but I would still probably consider this a low-key image. Look how powerful and dramatic that is, and look at how well that light is used. I'm gonna show you a couple more. Man, just see how the shape just pops with that backlit? And this one really just defined, this just defined it. This was the one I thought, look at how great it is to get the shape of the bear. I'm not talking about details in this. We're not talking about hyper focal. This is just beautiful. And it's easy. It's minimalist in some ways. And we still get that beautiful rim light. So while I wasn't able to show a lot of examples in my bird photography, the other thing I thought was interesting is Matt uses this in his underwater photography. So you could see some examples here. I'm just gonna flash through some of these more low-key images of his. I just thought it was really, really well done. I had a favorite, I liked this series where it's just really about that little eye that popped. Here's another one where it's just about that hint of color, where the rest is very low key. And I'll finish on this one from Matt, which is just really, really, I just love this. I don't know why I'm so drawn to this image, but I just thought this one was just outstanding. So follow his work if you're over on Instagram and you want to check this guy out. His name's Matt Sullivan. He goes by formerly homeless photographer. And as I wrap this video up, I want to finish with some tips and tricks and some things to think about. So the first tip I'm going to throw up here is to be appropriately artistic in the field. Here's what I mean by that. The artistic part comes from understanding the light and how to create mood with the light. And I showed you so many examples of this. I hope I brought that through to you. But the appropriate part is getting it for the right subject or the right scene. Remember I talked about being at the beach and shooting shorebirds in my case. It feels light, it feels airy, it feels colorful sometimes. It doesn't feel dark and mysterious or dramatic. So being an artist in the field and understanding when it's appropriate to use different techniques is really, really important. So be artistically appropriate, understand technique, because part of this is technical. We want to make sure that we understand histograms, we understand exposures, and in the field we know when to underexpose an image and how much to do so by. I will give you some advice on this. Preview a lot and chimp a lot. Chimp means you're looking and reviewing your images. Take a look at that. And if it's available on your camera, try to have the histogram pulled up on your camera and you can kind of get an idea of where the light tones are and where the dark tones are. And if we're doing this low-key photography, we're gonna try to remember we're dealing with the left of that histogram. We're gonna try to push those images out or that information to the left without going too far, because there's a point at which we can go too far and we can actually damage the files and we can't recover some of that information. Get it right in camera. So understand the technique to get it right in camera, and then finish it off in post-processing. Number 4, use light to create focus. Just because it's dark doesn't mean the whole image is dark. Remember some of these images, and I'll flash a couple up here, where the majority of the image dealt with these darker tones, but we used highlights where appropriate to create shape or create focus. So use light to create focus. And my last piece of advice is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to try something new. Don't be afraid to try light in different ways. Don't be afraid to try light at different angles. And don't be afraid to challenge your compositions. With these low-key images, a lot of times minimalism can be very, very powerful. So don't be afraid to try something new, and don't be afraid to experiment. Now that's my video on low-key photography for you today. I really had fun making this video. I enjoyed featuring some of my patrons in here. And I hope you like this style where I'm the practical wildlife photographer, so I try to show a concept and then reinforce it with images, and I hope that was helpful for you in today's video. I'm gonna do another follow-up video, probably in a couple weeks or months, around high-key photography, and I'll make sure I get a lot of examples in there for you. Down in the comments, let me know if you like this format and if it resonates with you, and if my style resonates with you. I hope you'll go down and hit the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications so you know when I have a new video out, and hit that like button. It'll push the content out to like-minded individuals. Let me know down in the comments, what are your thoughts on this one? Have you tried it? Have you experimented? Does this make you want to go out and do something a little bit different? Thanks so much for being part of my community. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.